Back with another video, and in this video we are going to discuss about fiscal deficit. So let's talk about definition, calculation, advantages and disadvantages of fiscal deficit. So let's get started. Fiscal deficit refers to a situation or shortfall where the government's expenditure exceeds its revenues that it would generate in a year. Fiscal deficit is actually nothing but the difference between total revenue and total expenditure of the government. It serves as an indication of the government borrowings that a government might require. The government that has a fiscal deficit is spending beyond its means. The government creates a fiscal deficit by spending more money than it takes in from taxes and other revenues, excluding debt. The gap between income and spending is closed by government borrowing. So, what do you mean by fiscal deficit of India? The government describes fiscal deficit of India as the excess of total disbursements from the Consolidated Fund of India, excluding repayment of the debt over total receipts into the fund during a financial year. So, what actually constitutes the government's total income or receipts? It has actually two components: revenue receipts and non-tax revenues. Revenue receipts of the government includes corporation tax, income tax, custom duties, union excise duties, GST, and other taxes of union territories. Non-tax revenues includes interest rates, dividends and profits, external grants, other non-tax revenues, receipts of union territories. Expenditure of government includes revenue expenditure, capital expenditure, interest payments. So what are the options for reducing fiscal deficit? Government often finance their fiscal deficit by issuing bonds which they must pay interest on. These interest payments contribute to the federal debt. The government can also print currency to reduce its fiscal deficit. The increase in money supply causes inflation, which causes currency depreciation and reduces the value of the government's debt. So the options are issuing bonds, printing currency, raising taxes, and cutting spending. So how is fiscal deficit met? The government meets fiscal deficit by borrowing money. In the way, the total borrowing requirements of the government in a financial year is equal to the fiscal deficit in that year. Now let's talk about calculation. A fiscal deficit is actually calculated as a percentage of gross domestic product, or simply as total dollars spent in excess of income. In either case, the income figure includes only taxes and other revenues and excludes money borrowed to make up the shortfall. The formula actually is total expenditure of the government, that is capital and revenue expenditure, subtracted by total income of the government, that is receipts plus recovery of loans and other receipts. For example, if the gap between the centre's expenditure and the total income is rupees 5 lakh crore and the country's GDP is rupees 2000 lakh crore, the fiscal deficit is 2.5% of the GDP. Now let's talk about advantages of fiscal deficit. First is increased economic growth. When a government resorts to borrowing to tackle fiscal deficit, it is believed that it shall be channeled to productive purposes like that of infrastructural projects. This in turn would lead to employment of more labor workforce, and since more money now flows into the economy, there will be the acceleration of the economic growth. Second, private sector stimulation. A higher deficit may go on to bring out about a positive fiscal multiplier which can go on to stimulate private sector investment. Certain spending by the government will lead to an increased fiscal multiplier, which is nothing but the ratio of country's additional income to the initial boost in spending that had initially led to the extra income. Next is prudent control. Whenever there is a deficit, a government may think twice before committing or making any sort of unnecessary investments. Higher interest rates may force them to think of various plans to pay back the debt as soon as possible. Thus, a government will exercise efficient and prudent control over its spending when it is in the burden of debt. Supports Keynesian view and helps during the recession. The Keynesian school of economics considers fiscal deficit to have a positive impact, as fiscal deficit, which is tackled by the government by resorting to borrowing, is used to channel the same towards productive purposes, which may generate further jobs and thus help the economy come out of recession. Now let's talk about disadvantages of fiscal deficit. First is inflation. The government may sometimes go on to print currency to tackle the problem of fiscal deficit. This supply of extra currency in the economy may lead to inflation and may also devalue the currency. Next is debt trap. Government will go on tackle the fiscal deficit by resorting to borrowing both from internal and external resources. The governments will have to repay the borrowings along with interest. This may go to eat on its revenues and then lead to a revenue deficit. Next is rising costs. One possible manner of facing the deficit is to increase the taxes. Prices would go on rising at the significant level, thereby leading to inflation. Standard of living may soon go on to drop down because of increasing costs. Crowds out private sector investment. The government, when resorting to borrowing through the issue of high interest bonds, may divert funds from the investing public that will now flow into the government sector, thereby reducing investment in the private sector. Thus, private sector investors may be crowded out. The last disadvantage is risk of default. The overheated economy occurring due to excessive borrowing may cause risk of failure on the part of the government due to excessive borrowing. So guys, thank you for watching this video and good luck to all of you.